Over the last 50 years, more than $1.2 trillion in aid has been directed to Africa. That's more than the entire GDP of nations like Spain, Australia, or South Korea. When this aid program first began, roughly 11% of Africans lived in poverty. By the 1990s, after decades of global campaigns and massive financial inflows, poverty had risen to 66%. Today, it remains at 38%, more than 3 times higher than when the aid program started. Back in the 1950s, the average Western European was only 5 times wealthier than the average African. Today, that gap has more than doubled, with Western Europeans now 13 times richer. Over half of all Africans live on less than $5.50 a day, and nearly 600 million people still lack access to electricity. Africa has long been poorer than the rest of the world, at least for the last 300 years. Western nations assumed the solution was simple. Africa was poor because it didn't have enough money. The answer, they thought, was just to provide more aid. Since the 1960s, aid to Africa has grown nearly 120 times. The concept was straightforward and appealing. When we think of aid, we picture schools being built, roads paved, and children vaccinated. For Europe and America, this kind of strategy worked well, helping them become economic powerhouses. But Africa's story has been different. Some attribute Africa's struggles to colonialism, pointing out that European powers left broken economic systems, which facilitated corruption and dictatorships. Certainly, luxury cars, presidential jets, and widespread lack of clean water do not help, but the full story is more complex. Increasing research shows that aid is not only often wasted, it can actively make Africa poorer. Decades of Western involvement, intended to help, may have unintentionally created the foundation for one of the largest humanitarian failures in modern history. For a time, foreign aid was considered a magic bullet, a sure way to lift Africa out of extreme poverty. In the 1960s, there was reason for optimism. After World War II, Europe was devastated and economically unstable, creating a real risk of communist influence or even Soviet invasion. In response, the US introduced the Marshall Plan in 1947. Between 1948 and 1952, America injected over $13 billion, roughly $160 billion in today's money, into Western Europe. The cash infusion successfully kickstarted investment, and within a decade, GDP per capita in the region rose by almost 35%. The Marshall Plan proved to America that aid could create wealthy allies and new trading partners, and it encouraged them to attempt a similar approach in Africa. At the time, Africa was recovering from centuries of colonial rule. In 1960, the average income in sub-Saharan Africa was under $150 per year. Literacy rates were below 30%, and life expectancy hovered around 45 years. Infrastructure was minimal, with very few paved roads or electricity grids, yet Africa possessed something the West wanted: immense natural resources, including oil, copper, diamonds, and rare minerals, as well as a rapidly growing population seen as a future economic powerhouse. Aid began to flow. In the 1960s, sub-Saharan Africa received $500 million per year. By the 1990s, that amount had multiplied 40 times to nearly $20 billion annually. Aid came to dominate African economies. In some nations, it accounted for over 60% of government budgets. Yet, despite these massive inflows, economic conditions deteriorated. Between 1970 and 2000, average incomes actually declined, even with nearly $600 billion in aid. Rather than reconsidering their approach, Western nations doubled down. In 2005, the UN launched the Millennium Development Goals, and the G8 promised to double aid in an attempt to eliminate poverty by 2030. Aid became a public crusade. Campaigns like Comic Relief in the UK, Live Aid, and Band-Aids Feed the World mobilized millions of ordinary citizens to donate, fundraise, and spread awareness, all under the belief that simply sending money would solve Africa's poverty. By 2010, aid flows exceeded $50 billion per year, a historical high. Yet, nearly 2 decades later, 400 million Africans still live on less than $2 per day, and the continent's share of global trade remains below 3%. Many countries are now poorer than in the 1980s. Why did aid spark European recovery but fail in Africa? Several explanations exist, including geography and colonial history. Recent research highlights one critical factor: institutions. Institutions, frameworks like the rule of law, property rights, and democratic governance, play a crucial role in determining whether aid leads to development. When the Marshall Plan began, Europe already had functioning institutions, enabling effective resource allocation, taxation, and law enforcement. In contrast, most African states were newly independent or inherited colonial administrations. These institutions were often designed to extract wealth for elites rather than serve the population. Corruption is rampant. Estimates suggest Africa loses around $30 billion annually to corruption, along with approximately 30% of all aid over the last 50 years, amounting to hundreds of billions stolen. Foreign aid sustains these corrupt systems, as governments reliant on external funding do not feel accountable to their citizens. Malawi illustrates this dynamic. During the 2000s and 2010s, foreign aid made up more than 40% of the national budget. Yet, huge sums were siphoned off for luxury cars, private homes, and international shopping trips, with minimal political fallout. Citizens had little power to demand systemic change because funding came from abroad. Aid also disrupts local economies. Small businesses, farmers, and entrepreneurs often struggle to compete with aid-driven programs. In Ghana, for example, over 80% of domestic textile factories closed between 1990 and 2010, erasing thousands of jobs and industrial knowledge. Africa's industrial sector shrank from 15% to 10% of the economy in 2 decades. Research confirms that increased foreign aid correlates with weaker industrialization, even according to the World Bank. Aid distorts broader economic structures as well. Export-led development, the model behind South Korea, Taiwan, and China's rapid growth, relies on cheap, competitive exports. Inflowing aid strengthens the local currency, making exports more expensive on the global market, stifling demand and reducing industrial growth. Today, African exports constitute about 20% of GDP, less than half the level of successful East Asian economies. Aid-dependent countries remain reliant on external support, while domestic economies remain uncompetitive. The theoretical benefits of aid, building roads, schools, power grids, and supporting local economic growth, are undermined in practice. Reports show up to 70% of aid projects fail to meet targets or achieve measurable impact. In Uganda, nearly 1/3 of donated medical supplies never reached their intended recipients. In Haiti, after the 2010 earthquake, billions in aid reached foreign contractors and overhead, leaving local communities without permanent housing or basic sanitation over a decade later. The failure of aid is fundamentally about accountability. In competitive markets, providers are answerable to consumers. Poor performance leads to loss of revenue and even business closure. Foreign aid lacks this feedback loop. Projects fail without consequence because governments funded externally do not face pressure from their own citizens. Ultimately, foreign aid in Africa has created dependence, weakened institutions, and stifled local industries. While short-term relief during crises like famine or natural disaster is valuable, long-term development requires strong institutions, thriving local businesses, and governments accountable to their own people. Until these systems are in place, cycles of dependency will persist, and Africa's potential will remain constrained.